This week, Ron Randall returns to Deconstructing Comics for the first time in 3 years. We catch up on his latest Kickstarter for his ongoing series Trekker, and also talk about the decompression of comic storytelling in the U.S. over the past several decades. Why did it happen? What are the pluses and minuses? Stay tuned. First, if you appreciate the work we do on Deconstructing Comics and our other podcasts, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. Check out our goals and rewards and pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. This week, my recent talk with Ron Randall about his 7th Kickstarter for his comic Trekker on the 35th anniversary of the start of the series. And later in the show, we'll talk about the decompression of American comics. Here's the conversation. Okay, I've got Ron Randall with me. How you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me, Tim.
Now, you're in Oregon, but I guess not in Portland anymore, right?
That's right. We recently relocated. We moved to a town on the Oregon coast called Waldport, and it's been a nice change for us.
Okay. So the first time I talked to you on the podcast way back in 2017, episode 579.
Good Lord. Yeah.
I was interviewing like half of the people at Helioscope Studio. Are you involved with Helioscope anymore?
Yeah, in fact, I am talking to you today from Portland because my wife and I just drove up to spend a few days in town to see family, to see some friends, and for me to have a couple of days to go in and work at Helioscope again. So, with the pandemic and everything, everybody was worked at home exclusively for a long time. And then gradually, cautiously, we've sort of started coming back in and, trying to be careful and everything. So I was sort of used to not having much time at the studio, not getting to see that great band of wacky cartoonists. We missed each other terribly. We had some of those Zoom visits, work parties, or whatever you want to call it, work parties. We just chatting, of course. But we've done what we can by and large to stay in touch, and so it's been great to get back to the studio. The Zoom visits are fine. We have sometimes have some long email chains chatting and stuff, and pretty hysterical stuff gets covered that way. But nothing beats being able to be in the same room with the people and had that natural flow of conversations and interaction. So, when we knew we were going to be moving to the coast, I always figured, I'm going to block out time, a few days a month or whatever it's going to work out to. I don't know exactly, but to make sure I spend some time coming back and keeping those connections and those relationships going. It enriches my life personally as well as professionally to be rubbing elbows with that group of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we haven't talked since the pandemic started. And how has it been with no conventions to go to?
Hard. It's
yeah.
It's kind of funny. Since I'm working on Trekker, and it's such a sort of an all-consuming task because I write the stories, I draw the stories, I letter the stories, I color the stories, and now with crowdfunding, I'm running the campaigns for them and dealing with the printers and all. I'm wearing all those publishing hats and marketing hats. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm really busy. So not having all that interrupted for going to conventions has been good in that regard, but in every other regard, it's been very, very tough. It's great to go to conventions for the stimulation of it. I love meeting I love being interacting with the fans, and we live a pretty isolated existence as cartoonists, as you can, I'm sure, imagine. So being able to go out there and get that sort of feedback and interaction with fans, and of course, colleagues, it's tough to. It's been a big thing to go without. I'm gradually. I did last year. I did the one in Portland, the Rose City show. It was just terrific. I had a great time there, but quite honestly, even though there was good spacing of people, and people were wearing masks. This is back when that was still, required and everything. But after that, I kind of felt, I sort of feel like I rolled the dice about as far as I'm willing to go at this point. So I haven't done one since then, but I'm definitely looking forward to it. So we'll ease back into it as it seems sensible at the time. Everybody sort of has to read the lay of the land themselves in this regard, it seems right now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your fans have certainly not forgotten you. You've got a Kickstarter going that funded in 11 hours, and I see you've hit all 5 of your stretch goals too. So,
well, all 5 of the initial. I've got. Thanks. Yeah, that's right. I was thrilled to see it take off like it did. That's. I'll tell you, this is like my 7th Kickstarter, and by now you'd like to think that I would sort of have things figured out. And I guess in some ways I do, but at the same time, every time I hit that launch button, I'm never sure exactly what's going to happen. I mean, by now I do know that there's going to be, God bless them, there's going to be a number of, of really, really dedicated and enthusiastic readers that are going to jump right on board. But once you get past that initial rush, you're just never sure how it's going to go. But it's gone pretty well. And the way I structure the stretch goal part, which is really, that's where the fun stuff happens. Mm-hmm. Once we know we're going to make the book now. What are the things we can do to make the book fancier? That's my first step of stretch goals. It's all the enhancements I want to put on the book. If we get a little more money, then I'm going to add some more pages that are like some behind the scenes making of the comic, where I show the thumbnails and the steps and share some thoughts about how I go about the craft of constructing a comic page, and then all the way through the steps of inking it and coloring and that stuff. And so there's that sort of stuff, that extra bonus content. And then there's putting spot gloss on the cover, and we're shooting right now to add this really cool, to me, it's a matte laminate, I guess. I'm not great at all these printer terms, still learning, but it makes the cover just, it has this cool sort of soft, satiny almost touch to it. It's very classy, and it makes the cover stock just a little bit heavier, so the book just feels a little bit more substantial. It's still clearly a trade paperback. It's not a hardcover book, but it just makes the book feel cool. So we do those sort of enhancements first, where I make the book a little bit bigger, a little bit fancier, wraparound covers, that sort of stuff. And we've just ticked off all but one more of those, and then it's when we start adding the extra doodads, the extra little goodies, stickers, prints. And recently I've started to explore like some little enamel pins. And the last campaign I did, it did so well that I was getting near the end of the campaign. I thought, there's really good energy rolling into the last couple of days of this campaign. And it's always great to have a stretch goal to talk about, and backers get excited about that stuff, and it's really fun to have more stuff to help send out when you send out the book, so it's like more of an event when they get it. And I thought I've done back to some campaigns myself that have these challenge coins, which are these really cool sort of metal coins. And I said I'd sort of run out of other ideas, and I said I want to have something as a final stretch goal that would be really cool and different. And so I thought, well, let's try one of these challenge coins. And it did really well. Readers got excited about that, and so we got to add one of those to the thing. And so we'll see how this one goes. It's doing well so far. And as I say with the backers, what are we going to add this time? Kind of the sky's the limit. It's going to depend on how many new readers we can get and what kind of support we get. And that's why I say, when I hit that launch button, you never know. I never know where it's going to end and how it's going to go. So it's pretty fun, though, along the way.
Yeah, so you mentioned this is number 7, and all of these Kickstarters have been for your series Trekker, right?
That's right, yeah.
And you mentioned that this year is the 25th anniversary of the beginning of Trekker when it was published by Dark Horse.
Well, 36 years. 35.
Oh, that's right. 35. Wow, 80s is that long ago.
Believe me.
35.
It's hard for me to get my brain wrapped around that too. The disclaimer I like to say when I mention that kind of staggering or embarrassing number of years, people might say, well, what has taken him so long to get this story told? There have been long hiatuses in there. I started with Dark Horse. It had its own series for a while, and then I was just publishing a little story here, a little story there with big gaps in between it. which is a terrible way to try to tell an ongoing series, as you can imagine. Readers would come up to me at a convention and say, "Hey, you can ever do any more Trekker?" And I said, "I put an issue out 6 months ago," but they never saw it because, if you don't have a regular schedule, it's easy to get lost in the weeds, so to speak. So eventually, I put the whole thing on hiatus, and I said, "It's just too frustrating trying to do these stories in this sort of haphazard or piecemeal fashion." And I said, I'll just concentrate on other things until I can find a way to get Trekker back when I can continue the story in a sustained, regular way to do the series justice and all that sort of stuff. So it took me a while to get back to it, but I'm working away happily on it now, and it seems like it's going pretty well.
And so this one is called Blood in the Wind. What's going on in the story at this point?
What's going on in the story at this point? So my character is a science fiction bounty hunter named Mercy St. Clair. And the stories start off way back in those early Dark Horse stories where she's a bounty hunter in this gritty sort of, almost science fiction noir-y sort of city setting, like something on a Blade Runner. Just tracking down bad guys for bounties. But from the very first stories, I knew that this series was going to have this big, long arc where she gradually is pulled into the larger stage of the events that are shaping the course of her civilization. So by the time we're in Blood in the Wind, Mercy is pursuing things in her past having to do with her mother and her mother's role in a resistance organization that Mercy knew nothing about growing up. These have been revelations that have been gradually happening as the series has gone on. So each story, there's like an action-adventure story and also little more seeds planted that are dragging her or pulling her gradually into this larger stage. So in Blood on the Wind, she's on this frozen planet far from Earth as she's pursuing some of these factions to try to find her place in this contest between the forces of this oppressive ruling, council and the forces that want to resist that and create hopefully a better society. So that's the place that this story has within the series. It's another step as Mercy is continuing to find her way. She's eventually going to become sort of a galvanizing figure in all of this sort of stuff. But what happens in this particular story is I got this idea that it's just a science fiction book, so I can put whatever I love about science fiction in this thing, which is the one reason I've been able to continue to do it all these years. Is I can always find some new fun concept to bring in a story. All the things that I loved when I was like a 13-year-old kid about science fiction, one way or another, I slip all that stuff into Trekker stories. And this time I thought, wouldn't it be cool if somehow the situation was such that she had this like a personal glider sort of thing. I was thinking of that, like that famous drawing of Leonardo da Vinci when he designed a gliding, except it's more mechanized than that, and she has to have an aerial dogfight with somebody else in another one of those. And so that's sort of like the set piece for the fight scene in the story is like that. It was really fun to play around with the visuals of that sort of stuff. Taking my character, he's pretty much a grounded, earthbound, sort of realistic, bounty hunter sort of character, but then put in this really, up in the air sort of duel setting just seemed like a fun new twist. I want every one of these stories to feel fresh and like we're seeing a different setting for the story to take place in, and at the same time still feel like it fits in within the context of the rest of the series. By now I've done enough of these things that I hope I've set a pretty solidly consistent set of rules to play with, and I never want to violate those or take the readers beyond what seems believable. So I try to strike that balance where there's a certain amount of freshness and, this is a new setting, and yet it still feels in tone and style of delivery like it's definitely part of the same series.
So I noticed there seem to have been over the years quite a few comic series about assassins and mercenaries. And what's the attraction of that topic? I've never quite gotten it. But.
Right. Well, yeah. For me, what it is about is I wanted to when I was first thinking of the concept, the idea was I wanted a series, like I said, where the character could, by pursuing a different bounty from one story to the next, depending on where that trail leads her, she can find herself in lots of different settings. I mean, it starts off in this urban setting, and then now there's like a mass murder. One of the early stories of somebody who has escaped, and he's out in the blasted wastelands beyond the city, and she's got to go out there and bring him in. So it's like a Western. And then there are stories where she winds up going off planet. She gets, trailing some lead there. So then you've got something where there's, spaceships involved, and then you go to different planets. So I like the fact that when the character is sort of freewheeling and their agenda is just based on trying to stay alive by bringing in the bad guys, it's sort of like, you've got an open playing field, and you can take the characters to these different settings and story dynamics. And what holds the series together is, you've got that central character, and in my case it's Mercy, and this the series is about the gradual evolution of her as a human being, and finding these discoveries about herself and growing as a character, like hopefully we all do as human beings. So that's the through line, is how is Mercy being changed and shaped, and what is she learning from her experiences, from the people she contacts, and start to play bigger roles in her life as they go on. So these sort of characters, they've got, because they're not attached, they're not members of a military organization or something like that. There's a more of a freewheeling aspect to it. So it gives more range for the stories to take place in. And the challenge is, in my case, the farther she goes along with this, the more that you realize that if you want to really fight against the big powers, you can't do that as a lone wolf. You have got to make alliances, learn how to be a team player, all that sort of stuff. And so that's the cool dramatic tension of the series is how can she still be true to who she is and, her own impulses, and yet also find a way to effectively, work with others, work and play well with others, like they say on your report cards.
Okay, well, I see a few components in there that would, I think, apply to a lot of the assassin stories that I've been aware of. I can kind of see, like, the being able to be in different settings and the independence of a person in that situation and so forth.
Yeah, it's and I think especially in something like comics, it works well. If you're writing novels where so much of the drama and the story shapes can, to a certain extent, be abstract and sort of internal within a character, or the dynamic between characters can be played out in sort of subtle, indirect ways. But I came up in an era of comics where very visceral things, people were slamming people through buildings and exploding cities and stuff like that. So I'm used to the drama and the stories being played out with that kind of a vocabulary, and a character who can fly about a lot, let's say, gives you more good visual material to work with,
So as you've been doing all these Kickstarters over the past few years, have you noticed anything sort of evolving or changing about Kickstarter or the process of doing a project? Or is it pretty much the same experience it was at the beginning, other than the speed of funding?
My approach is pretty much the same. And I think I credit that to the fact that the only thing I give myself credit for, as far as getting started with Kickstarter, the only thing I know that I knew was that I knew that I didn't know what I was doing. So knowing that I didn't know meant that made me terrified of doing it. So to reassure myself, I just went out and asked as many people as I could who had run successful Kickstarters themselves, and who just seemed to have a better lay of the land than I did. And so I picked a lot of brains and got some excellent advice on sort of how to structure and try to build the campaigns, how to shoot a video, how to make a video, what should you be trying to emphasize. In a way, running a Kickstarter campaign to a certain extent, uses the same muscles that I use when I'm doing the stories, and that is, I'm trying to be a storyteller. And to me, the essence of being a good storyteller, an effective storyteller, is selection of detail. If I'm doing a comic page, the questions I need to ask myself are: what is going on in this page, and what details of images and words do I need to give the reader so that they will know what is going on and care about it? And anything that doesn't fit one of those two criteria should not be in my book. So to an extent, that kind of training that I've sort of, or that sort of awareness that I've tried to develop over the decades in the business, some of that same approach goes about how I try to build and structure the Kickstarters, how I try to describe the story, and how do I try to what images do I want to use to share it, and that sort of stuff. So structurally, it has. Hopefully I've been fine-tuning it with each campaign and adding a few things here and there. But the basic approach has been pretty similar. Maybe the main difference is that the more campaigns I do, the more issues of Trekker I have out, the more I can add different types of rewards. Where this level you get the new book, at this level you get this book and the previous books, and that sort of builds up a little bit over time.
And are all the books are still available if people want to buy them?
Yeah, they are. All the Trekker stories are still available, even the ones that I did back in 1987 at Dark Horse, but only because of a campaign that I ran about a year and a half ago for a hardcover book called Trekker: The Complete Journey, Volume 1. I ran that campaign because after I'd been away from Trekker for a lot of years and first got back to it, Dark Horse put out a little largely black and white omnibus, they called them. They was this sort of digest page dimension versions where they collected, a lot of older stories to get them back into print. So we did that to pull all the comics I'd done of Trekker from the 80s and 90s and put them out in a nice volume. So readers could have a quick, easy catch-up bundle. And then I put out a couple of new trade paperbacks through Dark Horse. But over time, those all went out of print again, and Dark Horse wasn't going to go back and put them back into print again. So I was running Kickstarters for new books, and I couldn't point the readers to places to get the earlier stories. I try to make every single book that I put out of Trekker. I'm doing graphic novels, so I have flexible page count, so there's no excuse as far as I'm concerned for not telling a complete self-contained story with each book. That's very important to me. But at the same time, a lot of readers, they want the whole thing, of course, and I want readers. So anyway, I ran a Kickstarter to collect all the earlier books that had been out of print at Dark Horse, and I made it an oversized deluxe format. And I also, for the first time ever, colored a lot of those pages. So there's over 200 pages of Trekker stories from the 80s and 90s that were never in color before, and I personally colored them. So yeah, on every campaign now I can offer every single page of Trekker that's ever been printed if you want to get the complete library, is what I call it.
Yeah, okay. Coming up, what inspired American comics to decompress their storytelling? When did the decompression begin? What are the good and bad points of the change? But first, a reminder to join us for trivia quizzes, reviews of The Amazing Spider-Man by Lee and Ditko, and more. Check out our goals and rewards at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you'd rather give a one-time donation, you can do so via PayPal by sending it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Greetings from Wayne Manor Memoirs, a podcast dedicated to exploring the Batman mythos.
Each episode, we research a character, story, contributor, or piece of pop culture related or adjacent to the Dark Knight,
and try to understand why these topics are important to the Bat mythos. I'm Joe.
I'm Kendall, and some of our favorite topics include the transformation of Mr. Zero into Mr. Freeze,
the early appearances of the Riddler,
Booster Gold,
Kamandi,
Jim Aparo,
and many, many more. Check out Wayne Manor Memoirs every other Friday, wherever you download your podcasts.
And follow us at Wayne Manor Memoirs on Facebook or at W Memoirs on Twitter.
Until next time, Bat Fanatics, be brave
And stay bold.
So we thought we would talk a bit about decompression in comics, which has come up on the show briefly at a number of points, but we never really dug into the topic and kind of how we got to this point. Because, if you look at like 1960s or 70s comics, they're really compressed. There's dialogue everywhere and narration boxes and thought balloons and a whole conversation happens during one punch.
Right.
And I don't know, I did some looking around, and there are kind of various opinions about when the change to decompression started happening. There's some talk of even having to do with Stan Lee deciding to do 2-part stories and 3-part stories instead of 1-part stories. I don't know if that's necessarily decompression. Depends on how much story there is to tell.
Yeah, I think that my own take is that was more Stan just having a more expansive or grandiose, you pick your own adjectives, idea of stories. I think Stan was a great promoter guy, and if we do it as a 2-part, it's going to seem like a huge event, and we can build it that way. So to me, not that I knew Stan well at all, but that's my impression of the guy. He would just be excited about it as a way to ramp things up more.
Sure.
But I think those stories are still pretty darn dense as far as how things were going. So my own take on it is that, from my way of thinking, a lot of the decompression that started happening in comics was, to a good extent, due to the influence of manga. Because in the manga, you've got 300 pages of these black and white comics. And if you want to spend the first 20 pages establishing a mood for a scene before the story starts, you can do that. And it can be beautiful, and it can be lyrical, and it can be very cinematic, and all that stuff. It's different than having one panel at the top of the page where the caption says autumn, and then there's rain coming down, and that's the story set up there. You can do it that way. So I think that as more Western comic readers and comic creators got to see some of the stuff that was being done with that sort of more expansive, more deliberate pace of story.
Akira. Coming out in the 80s, or like one of the first manga to really catch people's attention in America.
Yeah, I think that was part of what was going on. And some of us also, I think, just some of the natural sort of gradual evolution, and I would argue that it's sort of the maturity of the art form in America. I've always thought it was ironic that comics were created here in America, but I think they were starting to reach a more mature art form over in Europe and in Asia. We were still sort of mired in the Batman 66 TV show way of doing comics.
Well, and the comics code, I think, was a big detriment.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Whereas in Europe, you were having, albums about, detectives and domestic dramas and let alone what's going on over in comics at the same time. As they developed, they had all sorts of different genres and styles of presentation in some of the manga and stuff like that. So as those things started to come into American comics, and honestly, I think a lot of it had to do when the writing got more sophisticated in comics, beginning with people like Alan Moore coming across and starting to write some comics that I had not read comics anything with that degree of writing subtlety and sophistication. And I think as that level of writing came up, you could be sort of more subtle. You could be maybe more sophisticated, and that sort of required a different kind of storytelling, visual storytelling, to complement and support the different approaches of writing that were coming in. And there's good and bad about this, as far as I'm concerned. It really depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell, knowing how to go about telling that kind of story. There was at one point a number of years ago when this process was happening, and I would hear. One artist was complaining, I got the script for a Punisher story, And the splash page of the Punisher story is the Punisher is sitting in a deli in New York having a cup of coffee. And he said, that's not a splash page. He's coming from the old school. A splash page is there's a coffee shop and the Punisher is crashing through the plate glass window, firing his guns. That's a splash page. They're both splash pages. It depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell and what tone you want to sit there. But to me, that kind of crystallized the difference, between the approaches. Where do you want to put your energy in what kind of story you're trying to tell?
Mm-hmm. I guess it was really in the 90s when it really started to catch on. One opinion I saw was that I guess The Authority in 1999, Warren Ellis and Brian Hitch, it's said to be like among not necessarily the first, but among the first commercially successful decompressed comics. Mm-hmm. And of course, in the 2000s, you really started to notice it everywhere. And, Bendis was the dominant writer at the time. And that was when I started to notice, like, wow, I finished reading that comic fast.
Right. Yeah. Well, there was an anecdote that I heard. I don't know if this is an actual comic that happened or maybe somebody just sort of exaggerating a little bit. But the idea that there was an issue of the Justice League where they sit around there and they have a cup of coffee. And on the final page of the story, they decide, I think this is the bad guy we should be after. But the whole issue is them having a meeting to decide who to go after. And like I said, it ain't the kind of comics that I read when I was a kid, where they'd make that decision in the first 2 or 3 panels, right. And you'd have 20-some pages of them flying all over the world, and there'd be explosions and alien invasions and punching people up and it's a different approach to go through it, and it doesn't take as long. To read several pages of people, and the number of panels per page that has dropped too. I mean, we're talking about those early Trekker stories I did, and I look at those, and there's a lot of 7, 8, 9 panel pages, and like you say, a lot of copy heavy pages where there's narrated captions and dialogue, and that was just those were just the conventions of the time. That was the pace of story and the style of presentation that was current. Mm-hmm. And it is gradually changed over time, and it just requires a whole different approach. You have to be able to make a splash page out of 2 guys sitting at a deli having a cup of coffee, and you got to find a way to use composition and body language and attention to detail to make that scene feel compelling.
Of course, I think both ways, compressed or decompressed, they're, some people do them better than others. And I think,
sure.
The decompressed version, I mean, you can make it really interesting, or it could end up being kind of boring. And there are some people who are afraid that, a first issue of a really decompressed comic is going to lose the audience because it's just, they read the whole thing like, well, nothing really happened. I guess I'll go out and buy Spider-Man instead.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the risk. I remember hearing years and years ago, early on in my career, I was working with one editor. We were going over a page of a comic. I was turning in some art, and I forget now the specifics, but I had a character making some sort of subtle gesture or something with a hand. And he said, "Well, this isn't really, really clear, and it's not right in front of your face." And he just stopped me. He said, "Comics is not a subtle medium." And when he said that, I think he was coming from a lot of experience about the way comics had pretty much always been right up until about that point. But that point was right when that was beginning to change. I think what can make a decompressed story work is when the storytellers are adept at doing subtle things. Because if you do those subtle things right, a subtle gesture can break your heart or terrify you. But if you try to do that sort of thing heavy-handedly, then it's just obvious and gross and that sort of stuff. So yeah, I think it's like you say, you're doing a gamble either way. If you try sort of a decompressed, very deliberate, very quiet, subtle approach to comics, that requires a certain highly attentive level of execution. And if you try to have a story that's slam bang action adventure from page one, and you just, it's like it's a sprint to get to the end, and it's exhilarating and stuff is happening all the time. If you don't structure that well, I think two things can happen. You'll confuse the reader and numb them because there's just too much stuff going on and there's no context for it.
Yeah.
And if you do that and you don't have them and they haven't bought into the character, then it's just mindless explosions. The balance that I try to strike with Trekker is, I know the stories that I tend to come back to, whether it's a novel, whether it's a movie I've seen or a TV show or a comic I read, I have to care about the characters. I have to feel some sense of connection to them, whether it's Superman and Batman, or some cop or whatever is going on. If I don't say, I recognize something myself in that person, and I really hope this person stops screwing up, or whatever it is, if I'm invested in that character, I'll stick with that writer through lots of stories, even if sometimes the plots are a little bit, lacking in imaginative twists and turns or whatever. But if they've got if I care about the character, that storyteller has me in the palm of their hand. Mm-hmm. And so with Trekker, while I try to fill those books up with, like I said, all the stuff I loved as science fiction when I was 12 years old, alien creatures and crash landing on the swamp planet and shootouts and daring do and swashbuckling action adventure like something out of Robin Hood, except with blasters. At the same time, none of that matters if the reader doesn't think, how is Mercy St. Clair doing this time? Oh God, I hope she doesn't, whatever, get her heart broken or get killed, or I hope she learns something, and I hope that things get better. That sort of, those sort of questions. The thing that means the most for me is when a reader says, I really like Mercy, I can't wait to see the next story. That means more to me than, that was a really cool spaceship you designed in that issue. That's nice. I like to draw nice spaceships, but it's the character, making the character evocative. And if you got that, then whether you're telling a compressed story or with people slamming each other through brick buildings, or a decompressed story where they're having that cup of coffee for 22 pages, it can work. That's to me that's the key for the sort of, for my approach to telling a story. It's all comes from these characters,
Yeah. So going back to the idea of what caused the decompression to happen, influence of manga, more sophisticated stories. Another factor I see mentioned a lot is how the big two got into doing trade paperbacks and getting writers to write for the trade so that they would have a 6-part story to put in one book. Now, was that a cause or was that an effect?
It's an excellent question. There's that whole form follows function sort of thing, but that's a good question. I'm trying to think of my own experience, because I was largely, when I was working for the big two, I was mostly working on ongoing series. So it's the monthly thing was still in effect there. You try to tell a complete story, at least a good substantial chunk of a story that reached a resolution point within your 20, 22, 24 pages. But yeah, there were some arcs that I was working on now that I'm thinking about it more, where yes, it was clearly something that was being planned to be, they wanted to get 4 or 5 or 6 issues. And so there was some, the stories, shall we say, were more roomy. And so my suspicion is, and my memory is, that I think that the sense of decompressed storytelling, I should say, was happening already. I think the advent of wanting to have a lot more of the trade formats come out was, I think it was a complementary impulse. But I don't know if it was... I don't know if that was. I don't think it caused it to happen. I think it maybe accelerated it more or something like that. Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, I think one of the biggest complaints about decompressed stories is the reader might feel like they got less for their money in terms of like actual things happening in the comic book.
Well, exactly. That's as I say, it's a risk you take if you want to try to tell one of the stories that's subtle and more deliberate in its pacing. That requires you can't have the same mentality as when you're relying on and shooting for exhilaration and a lot of stuff happening. It takes a different approach to writing. It's like trying to tell be an Alfred Hitchcock when you're really a George Lucas or somebody. These guys ain't the same. They're different directors. Their entire temperament is built differently. So you got to find out what kind of a writer, what kind of artist you are, and figure out how to play for your own strengths and stuff. But yeah, I mean, I don't know anybody who's read a comic in the last 20 years, or who has read comics in the last 20 years, who hasn't been able to put down one book and said, like you just said, boy, it didn't take me long to get through that. Did I get enough?
And I paid $5 for that.
and you're paying a lot more money for them now. Absolutely. So it's tricky because, like most popular culture things, there's a lot of imitation that goes on in comics. Somebody does something that strikes a bell or seems to be a really good, fresh idea. Everybody tries to find a way to put some of that into their own stuff too. And not everybody has all the chops it takes to really pull that stuff off well. So, the wheat gets separated from the chaff eventually.
Just because I'm in Japan, I did a little comparison here. So, like you buy an American comic that's like 20 pages of story, 22 pages, and it's all color, and it's like $5, where in Japan, the magazines are generally kind of anthologies with the latest installment of a bunch of different series.
Right.
So, for example, the title Shukan Sunday, I don't know how many different stories they have going on in there, maybe about 10. It's black and white. It's over 500 pages, and you can get it for under $3 an issue. So, in terms of story, you get a lot more for your money, although it's a lot of different stories going on, but it's interesting.
Yeah, it is. I think that has to do with the sort of the different sort of formats that people are used to digesting their periodical entertainment in. We over here had the glossy magazines and fancy paper stock and color and all that sort of stuff, and even when I started, back when I started Trekker, is at the beginning of a lot of the small independent black and white comic book companies starting out then. That was very much a counter move to the slickness that the color process was starting to become more sophisticated at DC and Marvel, and paper quality was going up in those books. And then you had these little black and white companies that were starting out, sort of pushing against the grain there. And they gradually, those little black and white companies in this country, they've had to go to color pretty much, haven't they? You don't see too many successful black and white comics being done, produced in America that way. And some of this has to do with, I guess, audience expectations or whatever. So there's that. But that does chain us down to it costs a lot more money to put out a 22 full color comic and that sort of stuff than churn out those 500-page volumes over in Japan on the cheap paper and the black and white printing.
Right. So what would you say are the pluses of Decompressed comics? What's good about it?
It can take that assertion that editor said to me, comics are not a subtle medium. It can take that off the board. You can do a lot of subtle stuff. If you're a gifted storyteller, you can do a lot of subtle stuff with decompressed storytelling. Drawing a reader quietly into a story, it's like whispering instead of shouting. It can be more compelling if you're in the right context. That whisper will draw the reader in closer and closer to you, and it gives them and you time to sink into and dwell in the story and absorb a sort of richness of detail, so that it can take on even a more vivid life of its own inside of you, I think, if it's done well. So those stories can sometimes sink in and hit really deep, and can convey more. Again, subtlety, I think. You can get shadings of emotional response, and you can spend more time dwelling on some things about relationships, things like that. So in some ways it can broaden the sort of subject matter your stories can be about in a way. So it to me, it increases the arsenal of tools that a good storyteller can have. Yeah. And of course, if you're doing a story, you can have decompressed sections of the story, and then you can compress it down and accelerate the pace of the story when you want that to happen. So it gives you more flexibility. If you're telling a short story, you've got to have things unfold at a certain pace because you've got X number of pages. Where a novel, you can You can have paces, you can change it up and down, the pace of the way the story unfolds, which can be exhilarating to have a reader have to shift gears like that. So I think you can do that in comics too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just thinking, for our Patreon, we've been doing like issue by issue review of Lee Ditko Spider-Man. And, those are super compressed. So if somebody tried to decompress one of those, they'd have a 6-issue arc.
Totally.
And I'm just thinking about, like, the points where we're supposed to, like, kind of feel bad for Peter Parker because something like things aren't going well with Betty. It's like one panel.
Yes.
Where, it would be like 5 pages now.
Yeah, exactly. And, there's something to be said for both approaches. Those original stories, they were like a poem, where every line has lots and lots of meaning. Mm-hmm. And you could take that poem and then you could try to turn it into a novella. And then, like you said, you've got an entire chapter is about what had been, one careless word that Peter uttered to Betty, and all of a sudden, he's got egg all over his face, and then he's got angst about it for 5 pages. Mm-hmm. Which, again, if you portray that angst in an entertaining, compelling way, it can add some richness and depth to the story. But in the compressed version, if you do that one panel right, and you have just the right words used to express what's going on, and Peter's body language expresses a lot, if you do that one, then the reader can imbue that one panel with all that 5 pages worth of content too. Mm-hmm.
Although sometimes it's like the last panel and it's got so much narration in it that there's barely even any room for the art.
Well, exactly. I mean, let's face it, that happened all the time. There's some of those great classic issues of Fantastic Four are like that too. At the time I was a kid, I was reading, but just exhilarating. But now I look back and I said, man, you need 5 more pages to really give this sucker some extra weight. Mm-hmm. So it can totally go that way. Where, yeah, I mean, like there's no one right answer for that fits all sizes here. Sometimes that being, I mean, I felt it with my own stories when I had to try to tell a story and try to make sure I got that sucker wrapped up within 22 or 24 pages. Sometimes I would have to compress actions down more than I wanted to. It imposed a certain amount of healthy discipline and enforced structure on me. But there were other places where it really did constrain me. If I only had 2 or 3 more pages, I could have really developed this more. And I think that it could have, like add an extra beat here before we get to the big moment would have just given it that much more punch. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, it's you just can't write a story that's always going to work out right to be the exact same number of pages as every other issue in the series. Mm-hmm. So some compromises have to happen one way or another.
Mm-hmm. So what do you expect the trend is going to be in terms of the storytelling? Do you think it's going to keep decompressing? I feel like it's actually sort of recompressed a little bit now compared to like 15 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I've got no crystal ball about this stuff, but I just know that in general what happens with these trends, it's a pendulum swing, mm-hmm. and it's gone to one pretty far extreme now, and I think it's going to start to swing back in the same way that comics went through a period where they were just, it felt to me like they were just getting grimmer and grittier all the time. And now, and some of that is still happening, but what I'm seeing, at least anecdotally, I see there are some, there are more comics that are coming out that are a little more, for lack of a phrase, sort of brightly colored and sort of lighter in tone and have a more playful attitude toward things. The art styles, there have been some art styles now that I don't think would have been as acceptable maybe or at least they would have been perceived as being quite as commercially, have the same commercial potential, because it just, that sort of stuff seems to go back and forth. And so we might be at one of those turning points now where we're starting to go back and try to tighten up the stories a little bit more. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Okay, so Trekker Blood in the Wind, when does this Kickstarter end?
It ends on May 26th. As we're speaking, we got a few more weeks to see just how high we can get this sucker to go.
Right. And so what's the URL for that?
Oh, it's trekkerkickstarter.com.
Okay.
I made it as straightforward as I possibly could.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, good luck on the Kickstarter, and thanks for coming on again.
Oh, Tim, it was great talking with you. Thanks again for having me.
The link to Ron's current Kickstarter is in the show notes. You can help the Deconstructing Comics family of podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. Next week, Emmett and I finish our look at Kirby's Mr. Miracle, digging in on issues 13 to 18. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.